Facebook. Its CEO is due to testify before the U.S. Senate, or rather, the committee of the U.S. Senate, in a matter of days. About 87 million accounts or so affected in that Cambridge Analytica data scandal. So let's get the latest details on that. Daniel Rangers joins us now live from Washington, D.C. Daniel, good to see you. Where are the accounts, these 87 million or so accounts, of those affected by this Cambridge Analytica malarkey? Where are they located? Is this mostly a U.S. problem or a global one?
Well, basically, Facebook is the global platform, but most of the accounts are based in the United States. So from the current run of data that Facebook's provided us, the United States accounts for 80-ish% of all of those disclosures. The Philippines, Indonesia, and the UK all have around about 1 million. So they're sharing a very small percentage of that. And then Mexico, Canada, India down between 500,000, 600,000 or so in each case. So just to remind viewers, what happened here was that basically an app was asking people for psychological questions. If you downloaded the app, you then consented to provide that information to friends. So a disproportionate number of people, without probably having much of an idea, had their information disclosed to this so-called researcher, who then provided that information to Cambridge Analytica, which then used it to target voters.
Indeed. So in this April 4th conference call, the Facebook CEO also saying he had, quote, not seen any meaningful impact, quote unquote, on the business, despite this appallingly bad handling of users' data. Does the market agree?
Largely speaking, I mean, if you'd have bought this share at the high point in late January when they announced their annual results, you'd be looking at, I think they were up about $193 per share. Well, they have dipped fairly substantially in the last few weeks, down to about $153, but we've seen some recovery as the Facebook strategy starts to come out on the public relations side. So they're back up around $160 per share. It depends when you bought the shares. If you bought them 5 years ago, you'd still be up by 500%.
Indeed. So given this data handling scandal, what is the market's expectation of Facebook revenues, at least for this year? Because we're seeing operating expenses forecast to rise by nearly 50%, but rising ad pricing was also expected to offset some of that. Is that still the case?
I think in the shorter term, there's a little bit more pessimism about the first quarter results, given everything that's happened here. But I think for the longer term, most analysts are still forecasting a pretty stellar set of results going forward from 2018 to 2020. So we're around $5 per share earnings. They're saying, you know, consensus, it could go up to about $10 a share earnings by 2020. So that's pretty healthy. I think most analysts are looking at this as a public relations problem. But, you know, Facebook does have a pretty strong market position. It also has, crucially, Instagram, which is very, very popular and pretty disassociated from the Facebook brand, even though they own it.
Indeed. So one last question for you, Daniel. Given the tangle of companies involved here and all the data that's essentially out in the wild, what is Facebook's potential exposure to fines or settlement costs to users whose data was illegally acquired, potentially used by Cambridge Analytica?
So there has been a breach of trust. But from a legal perspective, no legal breach, because users gave their permissions, even though this data was essentially misused. So there's a potential if, for example, there's been insider selling at a time when Facebook knew of this information. But we've seen no signs of that. And it's a very high bar to reach to get to the point where you can take legal action against Facebook when essentially it's followed all its own rules, even if those rules are flawed. So that's why we're seeing Mark Zuckerberg next week coming forward and being a lightning rod for the rest of the company. So the rest of the company can get on with dealing with the regulators, trying to satisfy them in a slightly vulnerable position very much so at the moment. But from a legal perspective, most of the experts are saying there doesn't appear to be a huge exposure at this point. It's more about compliance. It's more about coming into line with a public relations strategy that satisfies the customer base, that Facebook has its best interests at heart. That battle has still to be won.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. That's Daniel Rangers there live in Washington, D.C. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, on that question of what the market actually thinks, if investors are voting with their wallets, essentially, they're pretty happy. 158.33 is the relevant price for Facebook shares at the moment on the NASDAQ. That's up about 2% so far in the day.